While 20th Century Fox was able to find success with a special unit, Fox Searchlight Pictures, as did Universal with Focus Features, Warner Brothers' attempt to do the same ended up being a lot more short-lived and not as well known. That was Warner Independent Pictures, which saw the Shield try to jump into that same arena for a brief period. The division was announced in 2003 with Mark Gill as its president. The idea was to use WIP to release smaller films that would be used to help bring new directors into the Warner family, although to also seek the help of their established filmmakers like Steven Soderbergh to shepherd projects. While Gill sought to put his own stamp on Warner Independent, final approval of the films would still be given by then studio presidents Jeff Robinov and Alan Horn. The first film released by the division was Richard Linklater's sequel Before Sunset, and this was actually quite fitting. The rights to the first movie, Before Sunrise, were acquired by Warner Brothers after they bought Turn Entertainment, which included Castle Rock, the producer of that film. Alan Horn was himself involved in getting the first film made when he ran Castle Rock, so there was already that connection there. Before Sunset performed quite decently at the box office and received an Oscar nomination for its screenplay. Unfortunately, Warner Independent also released some films that did not excite critics or art house viewers, including dramas like A Home at the End of the World, We Don't Live Here Anymore, and Around the Bend, and this was despite some notable names in the cast. They did handle the American release of Jean-Pierre Jeunet's A Very Long Engagement, which pulled in decent numbers for a French-language film, even if it did not reach the grosses of his previous film, Amélie. Warner Independent's first attempt at a wide release was the psychological thriller The Jacket, starring Adrien Brody and Keira Knightley. However, critics were not particularly enthusiastic about it, and few people went to see it, so theaters quickly dropped the film. Things would eventually turn around for the division, especially when they picked up a French documentary about penguins. After recording a new narration by Morgan Freeman, they released March of the Penguins in the summer 2005, probably expecting it to pull in the usual grosses for a nature documentary. However, a remarkable thing happened, and it generated fantastic word of mouth, with audiences charmed by the penguins. The film became a hit with families and would stay in the top 10 for several weeks, eventually becoming one of the highest grossing documentaries ever, and it won the Oscar for Best Documentary Feature. It even inspired Disney to start the Disney Nature film label, although funny enough, they handled the original French release and came close to getting the American rights before Warner Independent snapped them up. There was also George Clooney's historical drama Good Night and Good Luck, about the legendary broadcast journalist Edward R. Murrow. The film was widely acclaimed by critics, performed very well at the box office, especially for a black and white drama about McCarthyism, and received 6 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture. Meanwhile, WIP picked up the US distribution rights to the Palestinian film Paradise Now, which received an Oscar nomination for Best Foreign Language Film. Despite those successes, Mark Gill was disappointed at not having final approval of the films released by his unit, and often disagreed with Jeff Robinov on the decisions he made regarding what WIP was allowed to produce and pick up. Gill would end up departing with Warner Brothers Vice President Polly Cohen, who notably played a key role in helping to bring Harry Potter to the studio, appointed in his place. Among the first films released under her watch was Richard Linklater's A Scanner Darkly, although most of that production was handled by Gill. That movie had been delayed from its initial 2005 release date due to post-production issues, and when it was eventually released, it disappointed at the box office. The rest of 2006 did not fare much better. Michel Gondry's The Science of Sleep did okay for a surreal fantasy film, while Christopher Guest's comedy For Your Consideration underwhelmed. That movie, which centers on a group of actors who start hearing Oscar buzz about their performances in an indie film, did ironically lead to Oscar buzz for Catherine O'Hara, but in the end she was not nominated. Warner Independent also released a film about Truman Capote writing his true crime novel In Cold Blood. No, not that one, this one. Infamous found itself opening a year after that movie's success and dealt with constant comparisons. It did receive solid reviews with particular praise towards Toby Jones and Daniel Craig's performances, but it still flopped, as most potential viewers probably felt they already saw this movie. Another potential Oscar contender that did not quite take off was The Painted Veil. This was one of the first films Mark Gill championed when he started Warner Independent, but he was long gone by the time it was released, and it did not receive much of a marketing push or substantial release. While critics liked it, and it did manage to get $8 million during its domestic theatrical run, the film did not receive a single Oscar nomination. Around this time is when the releases started dwindling, and Warner Brothers started to care less about WIP's potential. That film seemed to go out in as few theaters as possible, although Paul Haggis's In the Valley of Elah got somewhat of a push and earned Tommy Lee Jones a surprise Oscar nomination. Other films Warner Independent picked up that were given minuscule releases included December Boys, a drama starring Daniel Radcliffe, and David Gordon Green's Snow Angels with Kate Beckinsale and Sam Rockwell. There was also Michael Haneke's English-language remake of his controversial horror film Funny Games, although the commercial prospects of that film were never high. Although it does seem like the kind of film that if released today, a distributor like A24 or Neon might have found some success with it. In May 2008, it was announced that Warner Brothers would be shutting down Warner Independent Pictures. This news came not long after they absorbed New Line Cinema, which included their indie label Picture House. However, they closed Picture House at the same time, so it was clear the studio was just not interested in releasing independent films anymore, and any they did potentially pick up would go out under WB or more likely New Line. And any prestige films Warner released, like Letters from Iwo Jima, The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, and Michael Clayton, they were pretty content to handle themselves. There just was not a place for Warner Independent at the studio. The last film released under the label was Towhead, a movie they had acquired at the Toronto International Film Festival. Even though WIP closed in May, that film would not open until September, and like a lot of their other recent films, it was not sent out to many theaters. One film they had planned to release was Danny Boyle's Slumdog Millionaire, and that was still the idea even after the announcement of the closure. However, Warner Brothers themselves did not think the film had potential and even considered releasing it direct-to-video. Eventually, Fox Searchlight, which already had a relationship with Boyle, signed a deal to distribute Slumdog Millionaire, although Warner still retained a financial stake in the film. It would end up becoming a major crowd-pleaser and word-of-mouth hit, and eventually won the Oscar for Best Picture. It goes to show that maybe the folks at Warner Independent Pictures knew what they were doing, and maybe the bosses up the food chain could have had more trust in them. However, it's also possible that Slumdog Millionaire would not have received the same marketing push that Searchlight gave it, and it would have played on few screens like a lot of the other WIP releases. The lack of autonomy given to Warner Independent also might have played a role in its short run. Like I mentioned earlier, Mark Gill was frustrated having to turn down projects because the higher-ups at WB lacked his enthusiasm for them. So he watched as films he believed in and ended up going to Miramax or Focus or Fox Searchlight instead. Even though it's been over 15 years since the closure of Warner Independent Pictures, Warner Brothers has shown little interest in returning to the independent film space, outside of a few they've picked up on occasion and others they put on Max. Looking back, it was a noble effort though, and we nonetheless got some worthwhile films out of its existence. See you next time.